All right, let's get started. People might still be trickling in. Thank you for coming tonight. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Agnieszka Sobocinska. I'm Director of the Menzies Australia Institute here at King's College London. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you tonight to the event that we're hosting, the 2024 Trevor Reese Memorial Lecture. The Reese Lecture is given annually in memory of Dr. Reese, who was a distinguished historian of the British Commonwealth and Australia and reader at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, the Institute's home from 1982 to 1999. It's my pleasure to acknowledge members of the Reese family in the audience tonight. Thank you for coming. So each year, the lecturer is an early or mid-career scholar working on the history or politics of Australia. Previous Reese lecturers have included big names in the field, including Stuart McIntyre, Frank Bongiorno, Joy DeMusi, and Shalene Robinson. Tonight, we're delighted to welcome Dr. John Piccini to deliver the 2024 Reese Lecture. John is a senior lecturer in history at the Australian Catholic University. He's a historian of 20th century Australia and its global entanglements. He's published 2 books exploring the engagement of Australian activists, politicians, and ordinary people with global ideas. His most recent book, Human Rights in 20th Century Australia, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. John is currently writing an intellectual and cultural history of Australian engagement with decolonisation after the Second World War. Today's lecture comes from this larger project, which promises to offer new perspectives on Australia and empire in the late 20th century. This, I have to say, is hugely exciting work. I'm really delighted that this has turned out and that John has been able to come to London to give this lecture tonight. I really look forward to the lecture and discussion, and welcome John Piccini.
Thank you, Agnieszka, for that wonderful introduction. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal peoples of Mianjin, Brisbane, where I wrote this paper, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded over that land. I'd like to thank Agnieszka and the Menzies Institute for inviting me here, and acknowledge members of the Reese family in attendance. This is quite the journey for a first in family uni student from Western Brisbane. So I have many debts that I've accumulated over the years, and those who are here or listening online will know what those are. So without further ado, onto the paper proper. So, in September 1964, almost exactly 60 years ago, in fact, Australia encountered what one commentator called a visitor from another planet. Tom Mboya, the 34-year-old Kenyan Minister for Justice and Constitutional Affairs, cut a far from alien figure. Donning what was described as a well-tailored blue suit, matching blue and brown striped tie, and the whitest of Purcell white shirts, Mboya dressed the part of an international pro-Western statesman with aplomb. Yet, journalist Peter Hastings, writing in the Bulletin, remarked that the content of the many addresses and interviews that Mboya delivered during his 2-week visit to Australia and the then territory of Papua New Guinea came from a remoter, if more urgent world with its own ambiguities. So, the visitor's famed charm, eloquence, and soft insistence lent what was described as a pleasant, intimate atmosphere to events surrounding the visit. Indeed, Mboya's famed moderacy was a key motivation behind his invitation. It was hoped that Mboya could see Australia the way that its leaders did, as a progressive and modern country with an unwarranted reputation for racialism and discrimination. However, Mboya's comments on the need for sanctions on apartheid South Africa, that progress towards development of self-determination of Indigenous peoples and Papua New Guinea was overly slow, or that the White Australia policy, which he acknowledged to be largely a thing of the past, continued to plague Australia's international record, sparked recriminations, both public and private. Mboya's candid observations provoked starkly opposed responses from Australians. Some welcomed his visit as a breath of fresh air, a necessary nudge along the road to reform, or even a patron for their own aspirations toward independence. For others, the Kenyan risked turning the white world upside down. So my paper today, as mentioned, is part of a bigger book project about Australia and the end of empire that I will be publishing with Melbourne University Press. This topic has been explored before, but the focus has been almost entirely on settler Australia's kind of troubled transition from dominion to independent state. David Goldsworthy called this losing the blanket. Australia could no longer rely on Britain as a security guarantor. For Stuart Ward and James Curran, this was a matter of discovering the unknown nation. A new nation needed to be invented, culturally, socially, and politically, as the mother country embraced Europe. So what I want to do is decenter Australia in this discussion. By this, I mean we should look beyond what scholars have called the logo map, a very familiar one here. Sometimes we forget Tasmania, leave them off, but in this one, they're firmly included. Australia became a nation for a continent, as Russell Ward put it, only after it lost its populous and occasionally volatile external colonies. Most significantly, what is now the nation of Papua New Guinea. So acquired in 1906, the territory of Papua was joined with the formerly German-occupied New Guinea after World War I and became an independent nation only in 1975. Yet that these territories were a major part of Australia's 20th century story is, I think, largely forgotten by Australians. Or, as the late Donald Denoon put it, a repressed memory. But that Australia was an imperial power in its own right, in that it colonized Indigenous lands at home and managed, and at least attempted to exploit colonies abroad, needs to be viewed at the center of Australia's story of decolonization. Hence my interest in the story of Tom T.J. Mboya, a visitor, if not from another planet, then certainly from a place Australians only vaguely understood, and what they did know was frankly terrifying, or what they thought they knew, at least. So in 1954, readers of Brisbane's Courier Mail heard from Donald Horne, at this point an up-and-coming journalist, that Kenya, quote, looks so like Australia, you keep on expecting to see some old school friend come strolling down the street. Reporting from the capital, Nairobi, Horne remarked that the only difference was the country types here are festooned with pistols and ammunition. The so-called Mau Mau insurgency was reported in Australian press in a manner akin, I think, to Australia's frontier wars. Barbarity committed by savages who infested the landscape. This is the language of the reporting. And the noble, if occasionally excessive, efforts of British colonizers to put them down. According to historian Caroline Elkins, what the British called the emergency claimed at least 35,000 Kenyan lives, including about 1,000 who were executed without trial. As far as Australians were concerned, the optics were clear. Kenya was a fellow white man's country in peril. So, the decision to invite Mboya, to invite a Kenyan nationalist to Australia a decade later, is perhaps surprising. When Richard Casey, former Minister for External Affairs, and at that time High Commissioner in London, announced Mboya's impending visit, he did so by flagging not only that Mboya was well-travelled and Oxford-educated, but also one of the few young Kenyan leaders who were not involved with the Mau Mau. Now, Mboya's meteoric rise was arguably, in part, a result of British response to that insurgency. So, born in 1930, Mboya was a member of the Luau tribe, which protected him from automatic association in the eyes of the colonial administration with the Mau Mau, who they associated with the Gikuyu tribe. Educated at a Catholic mission school, Mboya found work as a sanitation inspector in Nairobi and rose to the position of national trade union leader by the age of 23. It's pretty impressive. I definitely wasn't ready to be a national leader in 23. Mboya was only 27 when first elected to national office in the colonial parliament and became Minister for Labour in Kenya's first post-independence government at the age of just 33. So while leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Gamal Nasser, or even Mboya's colleague, Jomo Kenyatta, are better known today, in his own time, Mboya was one of the world's most recognizable African leaders. And unlike those figures, Mboya was perceived to be a friend of the West. He was, as are all people though, a person of deep contradiction. Mboya travelled confidently in international labour movement circles, spending a year at Oxford's Ruskin College, where he wrote a lengthy pamphlet on African socialism for the Fabian Society. He also was comfortable amongst Pan-Africanists, of course. He chaired the 1958 All People's Congress in Ghana, while at the same time diligently cultivating American support. He undertook a national speaking tour of the United States in 1959, where Mboya met soon-to-be President John F. Kennedy, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr., and played an instrumental role in the famed student exchange initiative that brought Barack Obama's father to the United States. As his biographer, David Goldsworthy, very impressively, he's written a number of books relevant to this paper, put it, it is manifestly difficult to sort out one's attitudes towards so controversial a man. Now, it was in Mboya's public guise as the pro-Western statesman that his invitation was extended. As historian Gerard McCann observes, Mboya seemed the epitome of the moderate African nationalist in the eyes of the developmental colonial state, whose universalist discourses Mboya would seize and turn back on the British in the cause of liberation. The larger context should also be noted here, of course. In 1960 alone, 17 new nations emerged on the African continent, and the United Nations dubbed it the Year of Africa. Even more seismic was the notorious Sharpeville massacre. when dozens of Africans protesting the pass laws which governed their movement from tribal homelands were killed by white police. Now, this massacre, as well as being a horrible international event, also came to demonstrate the newfound power of African and Asian nations in international forums. At the Commonwealth Prime Minister's meeting in March 1961, almost a year after Sharpeville, South Africa's application to rejoin as a republic, join the Commonwealth as a republic, was rejected, despite Robert Menzies' staunch support for Pretoria. Amidst this troubling context, diplomats and officials in Australia hoped that Mboya's visit might present a view of Australians as warm, welcoming, and non-racialist. Antipodean anxieties might be somewhat soothed and the reputation repaired. This is the hope. So, if Canberra's rationale for inviting Mboya was transparent, what of Mboya's acceptance? It's not every day you decide to come to Australia in 1964. Australia was another Commonwealth nation, of course, and one that at least considered itself at that time to be a developing economy. The two nations shared similar climates and a primary export-oriented economy. Kenya needed educational and economic assistance, which it was hoped the visit would facilitate. So Mboya had also heard a lot about Australia, much of it not particularly positive. Now, the source he's getting a lot of this from is in 1963, a year before Mboya's visit, Nigerian journalist, I'm probably going to not going to do a very good pronunciation here, we're going to give it a go, Olabisi Ajala, had published a travel memoir of his many years touring the world, including 2 years living in Australia during the period of the White Australia policy. And entitled An African Abroad, Ajala wrote 3 chapters on Australia as part of this book. Intriguingly, his remarks reflect those of Donald Horne, who a year later would publish his now famous The Lucky Country. Ajala remonstrated that, regrettably, after its long years of colonial tutelage and later independence, the government of the land is still loitering on the crossroads of maturity. The White Australia policy, increasingly notorious internationally, did not feature much, interestingly, in Ajala's critique. As he put it, as much as I expected to find racial discrimination in Australia, I now have no reason to believe that it exists. The many Afro-Asian students I talked with confirmed my experience. So at this time, there's 12,000 Afro-Asian students studying in Australia, largely under the Colombo Plan and other kinds of initiatives. So that's the evidence that he's using. Now, the Nigerian was less generous regarding what he called the crude treatment of its Aborigines. So while Horne thought that Donald Horne wrote in Lucky Country that most Australians who may never see an Aboriginal, as he put it, from one year to the next, now seem to wish them well, Ajala witnessed at first hand what he called their horrifying neglect in the Northern Territory and at Sydney's La Perouse. Ajala questioned why the civilizing ethos of British imperialism had not been applied in Australia and by Australians. Why, he asked, does the Australian educationalist, medical doctor, or social worker prefer to work in some country in Africa or Asia, rather than discharge such a duty amongst the Aborigines in Australia? The answer, as far as Ajala heard from time and time again from Australians, was that, quote, the Aborigines are a dormant, uninspiring people to work with. And Ajala was shocked by this. he calls this a callous contention, which demonstrated that the wind of change was certainly not dawning on the Australian people. Now, why am I going on this Ajala detour? Why are we hearing from the Nigerian journalist, traveller, rather than Mboya the politician? Well, we don't need to wonder whether Ajala's writings might have influenced Mboya's expectations of Australia. Mboya wrote the book's introduction. Therein, Mboya welcomed Ajala's book as part of a flourishing in African letters, to which Mboya's own 1963 work, Freedom and After, also contributed. Now, this later book, Freedom and After, was closely read by the Australian diplomats who prepared to meet the young Kenyan. A character profile assembled by the African and Middle East section of the Department of External Affairs, which at this point apparently had about 2.5 staff, reflected widely held views of Mboya's weaknesses. As they put it, quote, "He has been described as too clever by half, conceited, arrogant, and inconstant towards supporters, attitudes that, quote, stood in the way of the full use of his talents." So here we can see the Australians are probably drawing on some British expertise, as they would see it, to get these ideas. So the character profile continues. While he was definitely pro-Western in orientation, the department noted that Mboya would reject that characterization, quote, on the grounds that he is pro-African only. Still, questions of Mboya's closeness to the Mau Mau-linked Kenyatta and the supposedly pro-communist Jaramogi Odinga occupied much of the document, demonstrating how Cold War considerations continued to cloud Australia's relationship and understandings of the region. Overall, however, the initial perspective from within the Department of External Affairs was that while, quote, he may come to Australia with some predisposition to find something to criticise, if only to avoid criticism for being pro-Western and anti-communist, his views tended to be balanced and moderate. So Mboya arrived in Australia on 21st of August of 1964. This wasn't a straightforward itinerary. Nairobi to Khartoum, then on to Athens or perhaps Alexandria, Bombay, Kuala Lumpur, and Darwin for arrival in Sydney. I'm displaying a BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation map of their different Asian and African itineraries. It's from 1958, so it might not have been quite this bad by 1964. But it took a long time to get anywhere, even at the very opening of the jet age. The Prime Minister's department had carefully arranged to ensure that Mboya's trip was comfortable and, importantly, avoided the appearance of discrimination. Nonetheless, despite the department having received an assurance by the BOAC agents that first-class seats had been reserved, Mboya's party was told upon boarding in Darwin that they would be seated in economy, or then called tourist class. Now, that this seeming faux pas warranted bureaucratic attention in the archival traces of Mboya's visit says something about the potential consequences that such a potentially racially charged decision might have made. As this sort of experience might possibly leave bad impressions, J.R. Rowland of External Affairs wrote to his minister that it might be useful if you said something to Mboya that indicated we regretted his movement. Whether feelings of discrimination informed Mboya's first public speech in Australia, delivered at Canberra's National Press Club on August 24th, is impossible to know. We do have a few photographs from the events, and there are about 100 photographs in the National Archives of Australia, of the visit. There were photos from the event show Mboya amicably chatting with senior government figures, including Menzies himself. Apparently, Menzies gave him a new tie as a present. And regaling a group of journalists who appear to be listening attentively. All was not, however, well. Richard Woolcott, then an information officer in the Department of External Affairs, condensed Mboya's remarks to have been, Australia's relations with the African states would be judged mainly on whether or not we impose sanctions against South Africa, on the White Australia policy, they put it in quote marks, and on the treatment of our Aboriginal population. Australian officials went into damage control. Now, Patrick Shaw, acting secretary in External Affairs, thought it necessary to, quote, enlighten Mboya a little, and also to suggest that he be careful about airing views on controversial subjects in public. It's unlikely that Mboya, or probably anyone, would have taken kindly to such a rapping on the knuckles by white decision-makers who clearly saw themselves to be his superior. Amongst the public, Mboya's speech elicited mixed reactions. Robin Golan, Canberra-based historian and member of the Committee for Human Rights in South Africa, thanked Mboya for putting, quote, principle above hypocrisy, above the hypocrisy that passes for diplomacy. Another writer judged, another letter to the editor, judged that if Canberra followed Mboya's advice, quote, we would then have betrayed into chaos the friendly, progressive, striving, anti-communist South Africa. And we would also have betrayed Australia. So, Mboya had a diverse itinerary, from meeting key decision makers to visiting an outback sheep station. There are many pictures of Mboya being shown sheep at outback sheep stations. Clearly a great tourist attraction that we all want to see, right? Indeed, officials were concerned at first that his program might be too heavy. However, he stuck to it, and indeed added further engagements with groups including the Aboriginal Rights Council, Shell Company, the Waterside Workers Federation, the Malaysian High Commission, and another Aboriginal welfare group in Sydney. Reflecting Ajala's views on white Australia, Mboya spoke publicly that he thought there is in fact a lot of relaxation of this policy, and that it will do Australia a lot of good if this relaxation is made known outside Australia, and even more good if the policy itself is scrapped. He was also in agreement with the Nigerian journalist on First Nations peoples, declaring their ongoing second-class citizenship to be, quote, a big moral challenge, and that, quote, there's still a great deal of discrimination against the Aborigines, in spite of some recent attempts to remove it. Now, these views were far from radical. They really reflected liberal view in Australia, more or less, that the white Australia policy should be abolished. The Aborigines deserve full citizenship rights. This was reflected in the 1967 referendum, a few years after, of course. Indeed, Rowland from External Affairs thought that some of Mboya's more caustic comments, quote, were designed for consumption at home. He was very anxious to show that he was behaving as a good African nationalist should, despite being the guest of a Western government. Now, overlaid diplomatic agendas aside, for some, even a hint of criticism was too much. Just going to keep an eye on the time. A hint of criticism was too much. Noel Hawken, regular contributor on international affairs for the Melbourne Herald, thought Mboya's manner in telling Australia how to mend its ways was sometimes has sometimes shown touches of arrogance. C. Chapman, in a long letter to the West Australian, wrote that Mboya should be told to mind his own business. We don't want to see any Mau infiltration into this country. Australia still clearly, according to these writers, needed protection from the dangers of decolonisation abroad. So, Mboya found Australia's geography, particularly kind of New South Wales, let's say, found that geography quite familiar. But Papua New Guinea proved altogether different. It was the roughest country they had ever seen. Mboya's Australian minder said. Many photographs from the trip show Mboya meeting local leaders, visiting development projects, and generally gauging the colony's quickening path towards independence. The idea that Papua New Guinea would become an independent nation was considered by white decision makers to be a fanciful idea prior to the Second World War, and frankly, most of them thought that well into the 1950s. However, against the backdrop of Sharpeville and those winds of change, Menzies had finally conceded in 1960 that independence for the territory needed to come sooner rather than later. A slow economic development and political advances that could best be defined as glacial were called out in a 1962 report by the United Nations Trusteeship Council, the so-called Foot Report, on whose behalf Australia administered the territory of New Guinea. Led by the British colonial administrator Sir Hugh Foote, the Council's report recommended a radical speed-up, a university, a national parliament, elected via universal ballot, and the end of legislative discrimination. Minister for Territories, Paul Hasluck, who had long resisted such initiatives in favour of gradual development, was moved to a different portfolio in December 1963 and was replaced by what Donald Denoon calls the lean, taciturn and courtly Charles Barnes. The ageing Country Party politician knew little of the territory and cared less. His staff, quote, resented the time needed to protect Barnes from questions in Parliament, and all were nervous when he spoke in public. I can think of a few Australian politicians that might apply to today. But his disinterest allowed those who ran his department to get on with the job, at least. Now, following the Foote Report's recommendation, national elections for new territory-based House of Assembly were held in 1964, and the University of Papua New Guinea opened 2 years later. Mboya was clearly impressed by some of these achievements, or indeed they were becoming achievements at that time. He said a great deal was being done in post-war development in Papua New Guinea, the Canberra Times noted, but that a greater sense of urgency was needed. In 1963, Indonesia had seized the Dutch territory of West New Guinea, an outcome Australia had long resisted. The territory's precarity was clear to see. A Pan-Africanist, Mboya saw Kenya reflected in the dark-skinned peoples of the territory. He declared, "These are our brothers." Yet Mboya was clearly troubled by the lack of national unity or national feeling as he saw it in the territory. Now, Mboya was not alone in these concerns. Indeed, they reflected those of the territory's emerging political elite. The post-war world was one of nations, which drew either on ethnic, religious, or geographical bonds, or a combination of all of these, to ensure cohesion and unity. The lack of such, what Benedict Anderson and others would call an imagined community, was clearly concerning to Mboya. He noted this on several occasions. Now, someone particularly attuned to this problem was what would be later Sir John Geiss. Born in 1914, Geiss was politicized by service during the Second World War and rose to the rank of senior non-commissioned officer in the Royal Papuan Constabulary. A devout Anglican, Guy's regularly travelled to Sydney to represent the territory at the Church of England Synod and travelled to Britain in 1952 to attend the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. He founded a mixed race association in Port Moresby in 1958, encouraging, quote, people of mixed descent, as was the common parlance at the time, to see themselves as Papuans rather than as Australians, indicating even then the importance of national unity to his thinking. Now, Guys had been a member of the old Legislative Council from 1961, a body run by the Department of Territories that had 37 seats in it, of which only 3 were set aside for Indigenous members, Papuans. Only 3 out of 37 in 1961. Guys also served as the special advisor to the Australian delegation at the United Nations in New York in 1962 and was elected to represent his home electorate of Milne Bay in the new House of Assembly in 1964. Now, able to speak 6 languages in an assembly that had 3 official tongues, Guys embodied something of the complexities that made PNG such a challenge for nationalists. His reputation as a, quote, hard-hitting politician who is constantly critical of the government and pulls no punches made Guys perhaps the only truly national political figure. And he was elected or selected by his fellow ministers, by his fellow members of the Assembly as their leader, a role that at that time was part chief minister and part opposition leader because the real power still resided with whoever was sitting in the Department of Territories at that time. During his short stay in the Territory, Mboya, quote, virtually ignored the white planter element and went out of his way to talk to as many native people as he could, including Guys. While understanding the difficulties Canberra faced in developing the territories, Mboya commented that from now on, Australia cannot pretend that other nations will have no interest, will express no views, or even take up actively the question of Papua New Guinea. The territory needed to take, as he put it, quote, take her place as a sovereign state within the family of nations, as this was now, as he put it, universally accepted as the prerequisite for orderly development. So this was inevitable, and something that needed to be hurried up, as far as Mboya was concerned. But Mboya was careful to acknowledge, however, there were feelings of anxiety about the future in the event of independence that he'd heard from many PNG locals. Would Australia not withdraw and leave them with no support? On this, Mboya suggested that Australia learn from decolonising Africa. The end of empire was not the end of the development mission for European powers. They were instead now participants in a competitive market. All the African states, as he put it, have continued to work with former colonial masters in many fields. And it would only make sense that Australia help in matters like trade and economic and technical assistance during the sensitive period of transition, lest other players enter the field. Australia, as a soon-to-be ex-colonial power, would have a range of responsibilities flowing from that. So, returning to Nairobi on the 8th of September 1964, Mboya delivered an address to waiting journalists. He was, quote, most impressed by the experience in Australia, noting that his party had been able to see where we wanted, and whatever we wanted. Australia was, to a large extent, a developing country. Mboya thought, and had many things in common with Africa. Too often, we think of Australia as just another European country. But I found that it is not really another European country. It's got its own personality, and the people have their own way of life and their own approach to things. He could proudly report that bilateral agreements on medical and agricultural aid had been reached. And Mboya then also reiterated many of the critical points he'd made at length in Australia to Australian audiences, particularly the underdevelopment of peoples in Australia's territories. Mboya seems to have been particularly shocked that there was, in 1964, not a single university-qualified Aboriginal or Papua New Guinean. 1964. Australian officials who he spoke to put this down to, quote, cultural problems. Such excuses did not pass muster with Mboya, who had himself, of course, travelled overseas to achieve higher education. Mboya knew the power that education and experience could have to the confidence of colonized peoples to rule themselves. So in a parting gesture, one that he did not run past the Department of External Affairs or External Territories, he invited two First Nations peoples from the Northern Territory and 4 Papua New Guineans to attend Kenya's National Day celebrations in December of 1964. To an outsider like Mboya, the problems facing Aboriginal people on the mainland and those in Papua New Guinea were similar, if not identical. The need for independence. Announcing the invitations on the tarmac at Nairobi Airport, Mboya made his rationale clear. I believe this will be very useful for them to realize that other people of the same color are getting ahead in the world and are doing quite a lot of very important work. Adopting a didactic, perhaps even paternalistic tone, Mboya thought the trip would allow them, quote, to learn on the spot what we have been doing ourselves in our efforts to develop. This invitation came as a shock to the Australian officials, who, as I mentioned, had not been consulted on this. John Geiss was one of the Papua New Guineans invited, as was Awala Wala Rurua, who was head of the Port Moresby Workers Association, and there were 2 other assemblymen invited. Philip Roberts, author, the actual author, of the popular autobiography I, the Aboriginal, which was ghostwritten by journalist Douglas, well, it wasn't ghostwritten, he's claiming the authorship, Douglas Lockwood is claiming the authorship of what is effectively an autobiography of a guy, of a person named Philip Roberts. So it's a remarkable and very, 60s thing to happen, maybe. Author of the popular autobiography titled I, the Aboriginal, and head of Northern Territory Council for Aboriginal Rights, Davis Daniels. They were also invited to Kenya in 1964. One journalist thought it humorous that Roberts, quote, a distinguished Aboriginal, would have, quote, his first ever taste of hotel living in darkest Africa. Roberts himself, at news of the impending VIP treatment, remarked simply, well, that will be a change. While white journalists made fun, historian of Indigenous transnationalism, Ravi DaCosta, remarks that this Kenya trip left a great impression on both Roberts and Daniels. Previously reserved, hard to draw out, even reticent, Roberts, quote, now speaks with poise and confidence, showing glimpses of a mind toughened by what he saw in Kenya, wrote a journalist for the Bulletin. The Papua New Guineans were similarly affected. Geis's remarks demonstrated something of the political tenacity that made him such a key figure. As he put it on return from Kenya, he was now convinced that there was a greater need for elected assembly members to play their true role in the governing of the territory. As he put it, we go to Kenya and we're able to talk to ministers in government. Yet in Papua New Guinea, we cannot see our own minister, Charles Barnes, who never showed up. This seemed an open and shut case for greater delegation of authority from Canberra. There's a very real problem here, Geiss concluded. So Mboya's visit also opened an ongoing line of communication with key emerging leaders, a South-South dialogue linking Africa and Melanesia. Faith Bandler, New South Wales Secretary of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, who was herself of South Sea Islander, Indian and Scottish heritage, captured the intimacy of these informal diplomatic links when she wrote to Mboya that, while I am a housewife and you are the Minister for Justice in your new country, I write as an equal with you, since our struggle is a common one. I think Faith Bandler was underselling herself as a housewife in 1964, but nonetheless. Historian Sue Lynn Lewis writes of the power of anti-colonial travel to, quote, bring strangers from disparate parts of the world together to meet for the first time, to see each other, to bow, to speak, to whisper, to touch, to embrace, and to share meals. All modes of interpersonal communication that enforced trust, solidarity, and created effective international communities. So you can see some of this at play in Mboya's visit and the subsequent relationships that were formed. The letters also reveal tensions, though. Bandler wrote to Mboya in frustration at Olubasi Ajala, the Nigerian journalist, who had accompanied Mboya throughout his trip. The Nigerian had been tasked with selecting Aboriginal delegates to visit Kenya, but Bandler protested that he was actually rather ill-informed on contemporary issues facing First Nations peoples in Australia, and that she could not possibly accept Ajala's stated support for British colonialism in Africa. While fully aware that he is in permanent fear of the White Australia policy, Bandler believed that no man with a black skin and with one atom of principle could utter such praise. While an international perspective was no doubt important then, during this era, it could also work to conceal key differences between and across regions. Mboya's letters also reveal that throughout 1965, Geiss used Mboya as a sounding board for his own quest towards national unity. I've got an image here of the letterhead that John Geiss was using in 1964-5, showing the bird of paradise that would become the key Papua New Guinean national motif. And interestingly, Mboya is also the designer of the Kenyan flag. Mboya was also the key designer of the Kenyan flag. So they're sharing a keen interest in the importance of national symbolism. So Geiss wrote to Mboya in February 1965, informing him of two key steps that had been taken in the previous month. For the first time, a bill presented by the administration, by the Canberra-run administration, had been defeated in the new House of Assembly. This is a very big step. It's the first time that they turned around on that. This was a radical move in and of itself, but even more so was the establishing of a select committee on constitutional development to be headed by Geiss. The latter move in particular shocked Australian administrators, but reflected Geiss's Kenyan learnings and connections. Mboya replied to this letter, enclosing a requested copy of Kenya's own constitutional documents and commending Geiss and the assembly he headed. This is the way to move forward. The secret is to keep your elected members working together. He also pressed the point on the need to, quote, develop a strong national political movement. For, quote, when the next election comes, you will want a political machine to help all your candidates go through as a body. Needless to say, such dialogues were not the intended outcome of Mboya's visit. Writing to the Canadian High Commissioner, Brownland from External Affairs expressed concern at Mboya's suggestion that the Organisation for African Unity could play a role in the development of the territory. This was not altogether a pleasing suggestion, since it might contain some risk of things getting out of control. Brownland put it. It was one thing for us to invite an African to New Guinea, but quite another for the OAU to take the matter up. So they're clearly scared at the consequences of these connections. Indeed, Mboya's trip sparked something of a rethinking of the entire Special Overseas Visits Fund, under the auspices of which his invitation had been made. Now, this had been established in 1956 to, quote, sell the unsellable White Australia policy to regional neighbours. In 1964, it seemed, however, that the scheme was no longer fit for purpose. At an interdepartmental meeting, A.L. Griffith at the Prime Minister's Department had, quote, been disappointed in the way in which Mboya, as a politician, had gone home and made the remarks that he thought other African leaders would expect him to make, rather than the positive, non-racialist views that he was supposed to imbibe while in Australia. Now, this was in the end, I think, a pedagogical failure. It was assumed that simply by dint of showing Mboya the real Australia, Misconceptions could be corrected and Australia's racial colonial baggage discarded. This is an incredibly naive assumption on the part of the bureaucrats involved, an assumption that saw visitors merely as empty vessels to be filled and discounting their agency in the process. As one Thai journalist commented on the scheme, it's quite logical that we will be invited to see its good things, but we journalists cannot write good on bad things. And Mboya seems potentially to have felt the same. So, on the 6th of July 1969, Tom Mboya was fatally shot on a busy Nairobi street. Such a violent death was, unfortunately, not an uncommon fate for Africa's first generation of independence leaders, or, for that matter, of the American leaders Mboya had worked alongside, who had both been assassinated in 63 and 68. Mboya's assassination and the mourning period that followed made front-page news in Australian dailies. Well, could you imagine the assassination of an African leader making front pages of Australian newspapers today? Probably not. The Age carried a large photograph of young men prostrate on the ground, wailing beneath a portrait of Mboya. Their hearts are full of grief. Their hero is dead. Ran the headline. Australian politicians, from Prime Minister John Gorton down, expressed their sympathies and mourned the passing of, as Gorton put it, a dynamic and dedicated leader. Africa can ill afford to lose men of his calibre, Gorton added. Mboya was well remembered by the large number of Australians who met or saw him when he visited in 1964, said Gordon Freeth, minister, who was then the Minister for External Affairs, adding that the nation was deeply shocked at his killing. Freeth bemoaned the loss of someone striving to build a progressive and democratic state in Africa. Those whom the gods love die young, wrote a Kenyan expat in the upstart Noosa News, which you can now read on the Trove database, who also voiced concern about what Mboya's death could mean for, as he put it, the most successful and stable country in Africa. This was not just the passing of a man, it seemed, but also of an ideal, of a decolonized Africa constituted along Western liberal lines. Now, such perspectives willfully ignored Mboya's own complex political views. He was not a pro-Western leader. He was a pro-African leader. He was an African nationalist. He was very clear on his ideas of borrowing ideas and development aid and whatever he could from the opposing powers. But it did reflect Australia's deep anxieties about the spread of communism and the end of empire, which they saw as connected, right? So by inviting Mboya to Australia, Canberra had hoped to recast African perspectives on the nation. No longer a racist backwater, Australia was now modern and reforming and firmly guiding its largest overseas territory towards independence. This put Mboya in an impossible predicament. Publicly, he needed to maintain fealty to Pan-Africanism and non-alignment, no matter whatever his private views might have been on Australia's evolving attitudes. So while Mboya's trip to Papua New Guinea sparked concern that African nationalists would place the territory in their crosshairs, it appears that Mboya made an impact that aligned with Canberra's long-term interests, even if decision makers weren't aware of that at the time. His visit and subsequent invitations to Kenya clearly aided leaders like Geis, impressing on him the importance of national political organisation, localisation of responsibility, and parliamentary sovereignty, vital building blocks towards self-determination. By the time of Mboya's passing, a nationalist political party, the Papua New Guinea Union, or Pangu Party, had emerged with significant presence in a new House of Assembly, and including amongst its members, John Geis. And the cadre of politicians that would lead the territory to independence were in place. So Tom Mboya's Australia was then in some ways remarkably alien. He really was a visitor from another planet. His experiences and remarks were, though, in other ways, perhaps surprisingly familiar. My broader project asks what we can learn about Australia by highlighting perspectives from the peripheries, perspectives that are normally occluded in histories of Australia or histories of decolonisation. By looking beyond the logo map and at encounters with numerous overlooked interlocutors in an era of world-defining change. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, John. We will open the floor to questions in a moment. There is a roving mic, which I'll get in a second. But I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I'm going to jump in with a question myself because I found that to be a really, really interesting, very stimulating paper. But as a historian, I can tell you that this isn't common. This isn't a particularly well-known story, even though it's a really fascinating story, and perhaps it's a story that should be better known. So to start us thinking, and just to help the audience perhaps contextualize this a little bit, can you tell us a little bit about why you think Australian history to date and the historical profession hasn't necessarily brought these perspectives into how we tell Australian history? I'll grab the mic.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Agnieszka. Well, I mean, we could just, like, part of it is obviously just historical racism. You know, the fact that Australia is a white settler society, which is, you know, committed genocide against First Nations peoples here. So, you know, like there's definitely an overlooking of perspectives from peoples of color, historically speaking, right? And I think, generally speaking, Australian history, maybe we're talking about this in the 1970s. I think there was a greater focus on Australia's connections to Africa, actually, than there is today. I think what subsequently there's been very important work done on refocusing on histories of conflict in Australia, frontier wars, massacres, genocide in Australia. But the stories about Kenya, stories about Africa, stories about Papua New Guinea have kind of been left aside a little bit in the last few decades. And I think it's important that historians think beyond that logo map of Australia as just a continent, because there are deep connections with Australia's external territories. That the external territories themselves are informing practices in Australia too. You know, that these were not, Papua New Guinea was, to all intents and purposes, part of Australia at this time. It was, Papuans were Australian citizens on paper until 1973. You know, they were integral. At one point, you know, people would say that Papua New Guinea was as integrally Australian as Tasmania. You know, this history got forgotten, I think, in the last few decades. Papua New Guineans have never forgotten it, of course. Papua New Guineans still look to Australia as, you know, the former colonial power. But Australians don't see themselves as a former colonial power. I think that is reflected in the history that we write.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm opening to questions. The first one was in the front row.
Hi, John. Thanks so much. That was such a great paper. I just wanted you to speak a little bit more about how this fits into your broader project on the history of decolonization. I understand a few historians are working on that, and how we write that without having some kind of finitude to it, you know, with also sort of saying, did it end, you know, and what other forms is this taking, particularly in terms of refugees and, you know, the way that Australia uses Papua New Guinea at the moment in terms of its refugee policy.
Good and big question there. Thank you. First thing, there are other people. Yes, this is what I'm doing is just part of a turn back towards bringing histories of Australia and Papua New Guinea together again. I think there's more focus on that now. There's great historians who are working in that space, there's a whole special issue of Australian historical studies that just come out, which focuses on the Australia-Papua New Guinea connection. The first time there's been a sustained engagement with that question in a very long time. In terms of where this fits, well, I think this is part of a story I want to tell about how Australians experienced the end of empire and how the end of empire in Africa, the end of empire in Asia affected the way that Australians thought about our external territories in Papua New Guinea, but also about Australians and what was Australia as a post-colonial nation, as a post-colonizer nation. You know, I was reading some documents over in at the British National Archives on Tuesday, and the British diplomats who are writing about Australia are like, "Oh, well, Australia, a former colonial power, is now one of the world's last colonizers. How interesting is that?" They're remarking on this. The British are aware of this, and this kind of contradiction of Australia as a colonized colonizer is an interesting one that I think Mboya's story fits into as a way of looking at, well, how does Australia look to non-Australians? And Mboya's story is part of that, I think. But you're right. I mean, this is a bigger story. It's not just in the 60s. It goes through into in the 70s and 80s. The terrain shifts, obviously. Decolonization becomes a Pacific concern rather than an African concern by the 70s and 80s in particular. So Australia's looking at the end of empires in the Pacific. That's a shift there. But you're right as well that decolonization is not a metaphor, as Dr. Yang put it, it's not a metaphor, it's a material process, and it's an ongoing material process, right? Australians are not at all claiming that any history of Australia and decolonization is calling an end to decolonization. Obviously, Australia continues to be a violent settler colonial project. But I think by looking to the way Australians thought about ourselves and thought about the world in the era of decolonization, we can tell an interesting and overlooked story about Australian history. Does that make sense?
Thank you for bringing to our attention that were played by Tom Mboya in Securing Independent for Fund. My question concerns why was Mboya shot? General belief is the rivalry between the two tribes. But is there any link with his role?
Good question. I won't comment directly on. The Opium Mboya's assassination is a very controversial one. There's a lot of possibilities in there. I guess it's just from my perspective, what's interesting about it is the degree to which it continues to excite interest in Australia. That Mboya was here 5 years ago, but his passing causes the Prime Minister to issue an official press statement for it to occupy front page news for days. This is clearly a very important person to Australia and to the world at that time. So his passing, whether it's the result of, a cruel mistake, a cruel accident, shot by an unemployed person, I believe, is the general line, or whether it's the result of tensions within KANU, within the political party. There are questions about that, but from my perspective, the fact that a Kenyan politician occupies the front pages of Australian press for several days is quite an interesting one. Yeah. Sorry, I can't answer a bit more directly your question.
Sorry, I'm racing with the mic.
Thanks. That was really, really fascinating. Actually, moving on from the last question and the fact that this was front page news 5 years later, I'm interested to know what the context for his visit was in terms of relationships between Australia and that wave of 1960s decolonizing countries in Africa. Did other leaders from other countries in Africa visit, or was this very much a one-off, hence the amount of focus? And if they did visit, did they engage with Australia's relationship with PNG?
There were other visitors, certainly. There were, in the 50s and 60s, there were other visitors, but Mboya's was the most senior to date and the most sustained in the engagement. And the fact that he visited the territories of Papua New Guinea is very hard to get into those territories. The border was very strongly controlled. They didn't let anthropologists, Australia didn't let a lot of anthropologists into Papua New Guinea. They wanted to keep a fairly, a cordon sanitaire around it. They wanted to keep out people who they thought might spread misinformation or might try to, incite rebellion or something. So it was very hard to get in. So the fact that Mboya was invited to visit the territory is actually quite significant. There were, of course, other leaders who came as part of the United Nations Trusteeship Council. People would visit intermittently the territories in order to, from the United Nations, in order to assess. But the fact that this is a Kenyan politician invited specifically to do it is significant. Yeah, there's not certainly in the 1960s, it's much less. It's very, very rare occurrence. Yeah.
Can I draw you out a bit more on that? Why
Sure.
do you think that he was invited? What was the purpose and the thinking here?
Yeah, well, I think that, as I was saying, I think that what he's trying to do, what the Australian government thinks is, by inviting, as far as they're concerned, there's some interesting stuff in the archives which says we can say whatever, white Australians can say whatever about ourselves, but no one's going to listen, because they'll think, well, of course, white Australians are going to say that they're better now, of course they are. So they say, well, an African visiting will do 1,000 times more than what a white diplomat saying the same thing would do. This is what they're saying. This is why, so they get a list together of African leaders who they'd like to invite. But Mboya is, I think, the most senior one who actually ends up visiting. There's a bunch of reasons, Mboya's trip is almost cancelled several times due to, political developments in Africa. It's actually quite difficult to get all the way across the world for 2 weeks. It takes a long time. It wasn't easy to go do that. And Mboya was very internationally traveled. He was one of the most internationally traveled African leaders of that period. So that made his trip more likely. But certainly the rationale behind it was very much, let's get someone who's clearly not Australian to say the things that we think we are, and then maybe people will believe us. Unfortunately for Australians, though, the fact that racism was not in the past became a bit of a problem for them. And those ideas, the sense of Australia as a racist power, very close to apartheid South Africa, did not go away.
Thanks very much, John. I really enjoyed your talk, and good luck, of course, with the wider project. Could you say a bit more about the wonderfully named Special Overseas Visits Fund and how many kind of people came under that scheme? Did any of them go as the officials wished in terms of what people took away with them from Australia? And were there other cases where things didn't turn out as planned?
Yes. On the Special Overseas Visitors Fund, the expert there is Sean Brawley and Matthew Radcliffe wrote a really great article about this a few years ago. But I mean, the fund itself was established very much, mostly targeting kind of journalists and opinion makers in Asia. That was the plan. It was very much to kind of do exactly what the Mboya tour was intended to do, was to sell Australia, to sell the White Australia policy. Because as far as Australia was concerned, the White Australia policy was not a racial policy, despite the white thing being in there. It was not a racial policy as far as they were concerned. It was an economic policy, right? And they were saying, this isn't a racist policy. All we need to do is educate people. Like, they saw this as an education problem. So this is why the Special Overseas Visitors Fund is launched. It largely targets journalists and opinion makers in Asia. And it's extended to Africa only in the 1960s, whereas it becomes clear that Africa is somewhere that Australia also needs to be paying diplomatic attention. But as I said, by the time they start to actually invite many Africans, the scheme is already going into the bin, because they've realized that, as the Thai journalist who concluded part of the talk commented, that showing people the good things, it's like a Potemkin village, like in Soviet Union. You invite people to go and visit, and you can see the good things, but you'll be able to see through the cracks, right? It's only so well that you can actually show, oh yes, we're really good. Look at this wonderful country. People will see through the cracks, and they'll identify the reality that you're trying to hide, So I think that was why that fund, the fund ended up getting scrapped effectively, because it was not really fit for purpose. It wasn't really doing, and wasn't actually going to sell the White Australia policy, because it was an unsellable policy. And it had to be scrapped, as Mboya suggested, and indeed was scrapped quite soon after he left.
All right, we've got about 10 more minutes before the wine's wheeled out. So take any more questions from the audience?
Thanks very much, John. Having worked at DFAT on a subsequent series of overseas visits, they still exist. They run slightly differently. But what I'm interested in exploring is this kind of transnational labour movement and the role that you think
Mboya's kind of participation in that labour movement really helped him develop a sense of a kind of a global community, and possibly then contributed to him wanting to kind of engage with Indigenous Australians and Papua New Guineans?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great question. And I mean, it shows, you have a little bit of background knowledge on Mboya, which is great. But yeah, so Mboya was a trade union leader, obviously, before he became a political leader. And he assiduously cultivated ties with the Western Allied side of the trade union movement during the Cold War, what was called the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, or ICFTU. So he was closely aligned with that organization. And he was able to use those links to get lots of aid effectively for the emerging East African trade union movement, which is very important to the development of that, to the development of trade unions in Africa. So that is quite significant. But yeah, right, it opens up a whole world, the colonial authorities kept a lid on migration or travel by colonized peoples. They wanted to ensure that people traveled overseas only in the way that was deemed suitable by the colonial administrators. So one way of getting out of that was religion. Geis is able to travel abroad doing religious things, while Warua, who I also mentioned, another who is a trade union, a founding Papua New Guinean trade union leader, uses a religious revivalist movement, moral rearmament, to travel abroad. But yeah, Mboya is able to use his ICFTU connections to get abroad and to become part of these emerging networks, not only of kind of white-led, international trade union movements, but also subaltern decolonizing networks, not necessarily the Bandung level, but, certainly South-South connections that were kind of below the level of the nation state, but which were very important, connecting professionals and emerging bureaucrats and administrators. Those trade union connections are totally invaluable to get out of the the colony, and to make those international connections. And this is why I think he, in turn, invites First Nations and Papua New Guineans to visit Kenya, because he knows the power of international travel. And clearly, based on the sources we have, those trips were influential. The trips, showed what the Australian administrators, Hasluck and others, had long said wasn't possible, And Mboya's idea of freedom and after, that you really just need to push for independence now and develop later, that was absolutely central to how the Papua New Guineans came to think. A lot of leading Papua New Guineans came to think. Yeah.
Today's lecture, I think you showed very clearly the legacies in Papua New Guinea and the impacts in Papua New Guinea. Are you able to expand a little bit on the Indigenous and First Nations side in Australia? So what were the impacts of both Mboya's visit, but also the visit to Kenya of the Indigenous and First Nations leaders? Have you been able to trace the impacts of that through the archives or through subsequent political movements?
Thanks for that. It's a good question. It's something that I haven't looked at too, because I know I've read Ravi DaCosta's wonderful book called A Higher Authority, Indigenous Transnationalism in Australia. That's a very good, and that covers a lot of that story of the First Nations side, I suppose, of the Kenyan story, but doesn't deal with the Papua New Guinean. So I didn't look too closely at, admittedly, but the Mboya archives are absolutely wonderful. They're kept at the Hoover Institute there in California. So yeah, really far away from anywhere that was really relevant to him. But they will thankfully digitize things for you, up to 100 pages for free of the Mboya archive, if you're interested. So I've managed to get hundreds of pages out of that, which includes substantial correspondence with First Nations communities I haven't had the chance really to look at yet, but certainly it seems that the connections are more tangible in the Papua New Guinea sense so far, and that, a lot of people might have shared maybe more the Bandler view, that, yes, that maybe the ideas towards First Nations peoples that a lot of African visitors had were more reflective of maybe how Aboriginal society had been several decades before, rather than it was now, and and had a much more paternalistic maybe view than they were comfortable with. So there was a bit of a clash, I think, of understandings between the African leaders and the Aboriginal leaders, but maybe more so than in the Papua New Guinea case, would be what I think would be my sense.
Excellent. So we have time for one more question from the audience. Sorry, sorry. Yep.
Are there any other international voices who have been effective in criticising the Australian policy towards First Nationers, sort of before or after Tom Mboya?
It's good. It's a good question. There's definitely a few. I mean, he's in many ways. Mboya's visit is an interesting one because it fits into a bigger continuum of African and Caribbean visitors. In 1969, there's a visit by I forget his name now, but he was a Caribbean Black Power radical actually who visits Australia as he gets in on a 4-day layover visa and holds like a very large Black Power kind of press conference effectively and invites several Aboriginal activists to that, and he creates a large a big media furor, about the Black Powers coming to Australia, so he's I think Mboya is part of a continuum of leaders who are of activists who visit at different times, that I guess they can be effective in different ways. So you've got someone who might come in and just be very, very radical and who might cause a lot of media publicity. And you've got someone like Mboya who was a bit more guarded in what he said and maybe kept his cards a bit closer to his chest, we might say, and was able to be effective in different ways. Maybe there are different ways to be effective as an international kind of critic, maybe you might say. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Can we thank John Piccini once again for the lecture tonight?